Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Maryland Almanac. I wanted to wait to get better at making videos before I made one about slavery, but since it's so important to understanding Maryland's history, I think I should just try my best now so I can build off of it in other videos. I'll just add a disclaimer that this is supposed to be a general overview and not an in-depth analysis. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to divide Maryland into three distinct parts. Southern Maryland, which includes everything that we would consider Southern Maryland today, as well as the DMV. The Eastern Shore in Northern Maryland, which would include anything north of Baltimore. And the Panhandle, which is anything west of Hagerstown. Starting with Southern Maryland, this is probably the closest to the slavery that you would have learned about in your textbooks. Tobacco was the main crop grown by enslaved people, and all of the major towns in Southern Maryland, like Waldorf or Port Tobacco, started as tobacco trading centers. Maryland is too far north to grow cotton, so the plantations remained tobacco plantations until slavery is abolished in 1964. This is seen as somewhat fortunate for the enslaved people of Southern Maryland because cotton plantations had a reputation for being even worse than tobacco plantations. Southern Maryland also had a lot of lynchings post-slavery, with most taking place around Bowie or Upper Marlboro. After the Civil War, this caused most black people to flee to the cities for safety, although in recent years many black people have moved out of D.C. and into the suburbs, making parts of Southern Maryland the wealthiest majority black areas in the country. When you look at Northern Maryland and the Eastern Shore, this is where things start to diverge from textbooks. The soil on the Eastern Shore in Northern Maryland is not as good as Southern Maryland, and after centuries of intensive tobacco farming, the nutrients in the soil are gone and it can no longer support large tobacco plantations. We're still too far north to grow cotton, so plantations have to pivot to cereal crops like wheat or corn. Those crops are less profitable than tobacco and also less labor intensive. Plantations can't afford to have slaves year round, and they also don't really need them. So what develops is a sort of leasing system, where a plantation would rent enslaved people just for the planting and harvest season. This leads to two big developments. First, many enslaved people are sold south to cotton plantations. This was viewed as effectively a death sentence by most enslaved people. But if you weren't sold south, you kind of had some free time. If it was the planting or the harvest season, you were still enslaved, but you didn't necessarily have anything to do. So black people used this free time to get paid jobs. They were tailors or seamstresses or launderers. Harriet Tubman was a woodcutter before she escaped. They were able to use these jobs to build wealth and sometimes even buy their own freedom. Over the decades, slavery begins to completely collapse in these areas, dropping by more than 50%. And by the time the Civil War rolls around, half of all black people in Maryland are free. And that's more free black people than any other state in the country, even the ones where slavery is illegal. It's often said that the western panhandle of Maryland didn't have slavery, but that's a myth. It never had large-scale plantations like the South or East. The soil and the weather are just too poor to grow tobacco in the mountains. But instead you have smaller-scale farms, often with less than a dozen enslaved people. Enslaved people tended to do more housework and chores rather than farm work. Towards the end of the Civil War, you see a similar drop-off in the number of slaves, just like Northern Maryland and the Eastern Shore, but Western Maryland also has hospitality slavery, which is kind of rare in America. About 11% of enslaved people are enslaved in the hospitality industry, and to understand why this is and what they were doing, you have to realize that they didn't have planes back then, and trains would only come around at the very tail end of slavery. So if you want to go to the Midwest, you have to get there either on foot or on horseback. Climbing mountains is really hard, so you want to journey along the valleys. The valleys are cut from the rivers, and the river that cuts the deepest into the mountains, at least in this part of America, is the Potomac, which is the defining feature of the southern end of the Panhandle. So the Potomac River becomes a passageway to the Midwest, and along the river springs up taverns for travelers to stay in. Yet taverns aren't just medieval bars, they're more like hotels, and they run on slave labor. You need people to cook the food, wash the sheets, take care of the horses. You need people to repair the wagons and make the horseshoes. These are all really labor-intensive tasks, so of course the tavern owners are going to use slave labor if they can. However, like with the Eastern Shore and Northern Maryland, this form of slavery grants black people a lot more autonomy than typically what's depicted in media. And so the free population also begins growing rapidly in the years leading up to the end of slavery. And that's the general overview of slavery in Maryland. There was a lot that I wanted to talk about, but it's been so long since I've published a video, I just needed to get this out the door. So that's it for this time. If there's anything in this video that you found interesting or want me to talk more about, I would be happy to. Just let me know in the comments below.